Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going somewhere you might not expect. We're going inside the brain of a California ground squirrel.
Sounds exciting.
Yeah, it is. And we're going all the way back to 1919 to explore a research paper by Harold J. Cooper. It's called The Hypophysis Cerebri of the California Ground Squirrel.
Wow, 1919. That's going way back.
Yeah, we're going old school today. And you might be wondering, why ground squirrel brains? What's so special about them?
Yeah, I can see why someone might ask that.
Well, this paper focuses on a tiny but really important part of the brain called the hypophysis cerebri, which is also known as the pituitary gland.
Ah, the pituitary gland. The master gland.
Exactly. It's this tiny structure that has a huge impact. It controls things like growth metabolism and a whole bunch of other essential functions.
It's like the conductor of an orchestra, sending out hormonal signals that tell other glands and organs what to do.
Perfect analogy. So Cooper was basically trying to understand this conductor in ground squirrels. And to do that, he had to collect those squirrels. Now, I have to say, the methods back then were a little different from what we'd use today.
Yeah, I'd imagine so.
Let's just say scientific methods have evolved quite a bit since 1919. But what's remarkable is the care Cooper took in extracting those tiny pituitary glands and preparing them for examination under a microscope.
I can only imagine the patience and precision that must have required working with those delicate structures over 100 years ago.
Seriously, it's mind-blowing.
Yeah.
So what did he actually find when he looked at those squirrel brains under the microscope?
Well, he was really interested in classifying the different cells within the pituitary gland. He used the terms chromophile and chromophobe to describe them.
Chromo what? Can you break those down for us?
Sure, so chromophile cells are the ones that love to soak up dye. They're like little sponges for color. And when you look at them under a microscope, they appear brightly colored because of those dyes.
Okay, so they're the colorful ones. And what about the chromophobes?
Those are the opposite. They're like the wallflowers of the pituitary world. They don't absorb dye as readily, so they appear much paler under the microscope.
Interesting. So it's like you've got these two distinct populations of cells in the pituitary gland, the colorful ones and the pale ones. Did they know back then why some cells were chromophiles and others were chromophobes?
Well, there was a lot of debate at the time about whether these were actually different types of cells or just different stages of the same cell. It's like some scientists thought maybe the chromophobes were just immature chromophiles or something like that.
That's like a cellular identity crisis.
Yeah, kind of. And Cooper's observations actually added fuel to that debate. He found that in ground squirrels, there was this whole spectrum of cell appearances. Some cells were clearly chromophiles, others were clearly chromophobes, but there were also some in between that blurred the lines.
So it wasn't so clear-cut.
Not at all. It made it difficult to draw those neat categories. And to add another layer of complexity to this whole thing, Cooper decided to use dyes to study these cells. Specifically, he used orange G and acid fusantin.
So he was basically painting those pituitary cells.
In a way, yes. He was using those dyes to try and understand the different types of cells and what they might be doing.
I see. So was it like a color-coded system? Like if a cell stained orange, it meant one thing, and if it stained red, it meant something else?
There was another scientist at the time named Scafidi who believed that these dyes could actually reveal distinct functional types of cells. Like each color represented a specific job for the cell.
That's pretty cool, like a cellular job chart based on color.
Yeah, it was a pretty intriguing idea. But Cooper, being the thorough scientist that he was, decided to test it out.
So he wanted to see if Scafidi's theory held up.
Exactly. He used multiple dyes, and what he found was that the same cell could actually stain with different colors depending on which dye he used.
Oh, so that kind of debunked Scafidi's idea.
Yeah, pretty much. It showed that the color a cell stained wasn't necessarily a reliable indicator of its function.
That's a great example of how science works,
Yes.
right? You come up with a hypothesis, you test it out, and sometimes the results lead you in a different direction.
Absolutely. And it speaks to Cooper's critical thinking and his willingness to challenge existing ideas.
So he was a real scientific pioneer. And speaking of those cells he was studying, Cooper noticed something interesting about the structure of the pituitary gland. He even used some pretty fancy terms to describe the different parts. He called them the pars distalis and the pars infundibularis.
Yes, those are classic anatomical terms.
Can you break those down for us? What do they actually mean?
Sure, so imagine the pituitary gland as a city. The pars distalis is like the bustling downtown area. It's packed with a variety of cell types, and it has a rich blood supply. It's where a lot of the action is happening.
Okay, so the pars distalis is like the heart of the pituitary city.
Exactly. And then you have the pars infundibularis, which is more like a quiet suburban neighborhood. It has a specific type of cell and less blood flow. It's a bit more mysterious, its function not as readily apparent.
So different areas, different vibes, but they're both part of the same city, right? How do they work together?
That's a key question, and one that Cooper was clearly grappling with. He was particularly interested in how these cells in both the downtown and the suburban areas of the pituitary might be communicating with the rest of the body.
Like, how are they sending their messages out?
Exactly. And this is where his observations about secretion, particularly in the pars distalis, become really significant.
Because he found evidence that pituitary cells release substances directly into the bloodstream.
You got it. He noticed all sorts of visual clues under the microscope that pointed towards this secretory process, particularly in the pars distalis.
What kind of clues?
He observed cells that had irregular shapes, and he saw these granules clustered near blood vessels. All of these things hinted at the release of substances into the bloodstream.
So pars distalis is like the main shipping center sending out hormonal packages to the rest of the body.
Precisely. And Cooper's observations provided some of the earliest evidence to support this idea of endocrine signaling.
Which is basically how hormones travel through the blood to communicate with different parts of the body, right?
That's it. It's a fundamental concept in endocrinology today. But back then, it was still a relatively new idea.
So Cooper was on the cutting edge of endocrine research. His work was really ahead of its time.
Absolutely. But amidst all these groundbreaking findings, he also encountered a bit of a mystery, a substance that he referred to as colloid.
Colloid, what's that?
Well, it's this substance found within the pituitary gland. And to be honest, it was a bit of an enigma even back then. And it still is, to some extent.
So what did he know about it?
He observed different types of colloid cysts, some filled with granules, others clear, and they were located in different parts of the gland.
So it wasn't like a uniform substance?
Nope. There seemed to be different variations of it.
Did he have any ideas about what this colloid stuff was doing in the pituitary gland?
That was the million-dollar question. Was it a concentrated secretion from the cells? Was it cellular debris? Or maybe it was some kind of storage reservoir for hormones. Cooper's research didn't offer any definitive answers, but it definitely added to the ongoing discussion about the colloid's origin and its purpose.
Sounds like a real head-scratcher.
It was. And it just goes to show that even with all his meticulous observations, some things remained a mystery.
That's the beauty of science, isn't it? There's always more to discover, more to learn.
Exactly. Every answer often leads to more questions.
Well, we've certainly uncovered a lot of fascinating insights today. We've explored those diverse cell types, the idea of endocrine signaling, and that enigmatic colloid, but there's still so much more to unpack.
You know it.
We were just talking about those two main parts of the pituitary gland, the pars distalis and the pars infundibularis, the bustling downtown and the quieter suburb. But we didn't really get into how they might work together. Did Cooper's research shed any light on that?
What's a really interesting question, isn't it? You've got these two distinct areas within the same gland, and they must be communicating somehow, but exactly how they interact is still not fully understood.
So even Cooper, with his meticulous observations, couldn't crack that code.
Not completely, but his findings about secretion, particularly in the pars distalis, offer some pretty compelling clues.
Right. We were talking about those irregularly shaped cells and the granules clustered near blood vessels. It all pointed towards those cells releasing substances into the bloodstream.
Exactly. And if you think back to our city analogy, the pars distalis, with all those different cell types and its abundant blood supply, it's like the main hub for sending out those hormonal messages.
It's packing them up and shipping them out via the bloodstream to all the different parts of the body.
Precisely. And Cooper's observations were really some of the first to support this whole idea of endocrine signaling, which is basically how hormones communicate with those far-off organs and tissues.
It's like a long-distance calling system for the body.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And it's a concept that's fundamental to how we understand the endocrine system today.
It's amazing to think about how those early observations laid the groundwork for so much of what we know now. But what about the pars infundibularis? It seemed a bit more mysterious with that lower blood flow and all that colloid. What was Cooper's take on its function?
Yeah, the pars infundibularis was definitely more of a puzzle. Cooper couldn't definitively pin down its role, but his observations, particularly regarding the colloid, definitely raised some interesting questions.
Oh yeah, that enigmatic colloid. We talked about how it seemed to come in different forms with those cysts, some filled with granules and others clear.
Right, and Cooper found a particularly high concentration of this colloid in the pars infundibularis, which led him to speculate about its potential role in the whole secretion process.
So maybe while the pars distalis is busy packaging and shipping out those hormonal messages, the pars infundibularis is involved in some other aspect of production or storage.
That's a great way to think about it. Like maybe it's doing some behind-the-scenes work that's essential for the whole system to function properly.
It's like the pars infundibularis is the manufacturing plant where those hormones are being made or modified before they're shipped out by the pars distalis.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. But, even today, the exact function of the colloid and the role of the pars infundibularis are still being studied. There's a lot we don't know yet.
So even though Cooper couldn't solve the mystery completely, his work helped to focus attention on these areas and inspired future research.
Absolutely. He might not have had all the answers, but he was asking the right questions.
And that's what drives scientific progress, isn't it? Asking those questions and searching for answers.
For sure. So we've talked about the pars distalis and the pars infundibularis, but there's another important piece to this puzzle that we haven't touched on yet. We know that the pituitary gland is connected to the brain, but how do those two systems interact?
That's a good point. Did Cooper's research shed any light on that connection?
He did. In fact, the terms he used for the two parts of the pituitary, the pars buccalis and the pars neuralis, actually highlight this connection.
Pars buccalis, pars neuralis, those are different from the terms we've been using.
They are, but they actually refer to the same parts of the pituitary. Pars buccalis is another name for the pars distalis, and pars neuralis is another name for the pars infundibularis.
Okay, so why the different names?
Well, the terms buccalis and neuralis tell us something about the developmental origins of these structures.
So it's like looking back in time to see where they came from.
Exactly. The pars buccalis, or pars distalis, develops from the roof of the mouth, which explains the term buccalis. And the pars neuralis, or pars infundibularis, originates from the brain, hence the term neuralis.
That's fascinating. So even though they're physically connected and working together in the adult ground squirrel, these two parts of the pituitary actually have very different developmental origins.
It really highlights the interconnectedness of different systems in the body and how those systems evolve and change over time.
And what about the communication between the brain and the pituitary? Did Cooper's observations offer any clues about how that might work?
Oh, definitely. He observed nerve fibers running through the pars neuralis, the part that's directly connected to the brain.
So it's like the brain has a direct line to the pituitary.
Yeah, essentially. And those nerve fibers strongly suggest that the brain is sending signals to the pituitary, probably influencing its activity.
So it's like the brain is sending instructions to the pituitary, telling it what to do.
You got it. And based on what we know today about the endocrine system, we can infer that those signals from the brain are probably carrying information about the body's internal state. Things like stress levels, nutrient availability, and reproductive status.
So the brain is constantly monitoring what's going on in the body and then using the pituitary gland to orchestrate the appropriate hormonal responses.
Exactly. Like imagine the brain as the conductor of an orchestra, and the pituitary gland is this incredibly talented musician who can play all sorts of different instruments. The brain is sending these signals to the pituitary, telling it which instrument to play and how loud to play it.
And those instruments are the hormones that the pituitary releases into the bloodstream.
You got it. And those hormones go on to influence a whole range of bodily functions.
It's really an amazing system when you think about it. And Cooper's research provided some of the very first glimpses into how this complex communication network might be working.
It's true. He might not have had all the pieces of the puzzle, but his careful observations and insightful interpretations really laid the foundation for a lot of what we know today about the brain and the endocrine system and how they work together to maintain balance in the body.
This whole deep dive is really making me appreciate how interconnected everything is within the body. It's like one giant symphony with all these different players working in harmony.
It really is. And it's a symphony that scientists are still trying to fully understand. We've come a long way since Cooper's time, but there's still so much more to learn.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, from those diverse cell types to that enigmatic colloid and the fascinating connection between the brain and the pituitary gland. But there are still some loose ends to tie up.
You know it. We still need to talk about what happened to that mysterious colloid and how Cooper's findings on endocrine signaling shaped our understanding of hormonal communication.
Wow. We've really gone deep into Harold J. Cooper's 1919 research on the pituitary gland of the California ground squirrel.
Yeah, we have, haven't we?
It's been amazing to trace his process from meticulously categorizing those pituitary cells to challenging existing theories about cell function with those dye experiments.
Absolutely. And then there's his contribution to our understanding of endocrine, signaling the idea that hormones travel through the bloodstream to talk to different parts of the body. It's groundbreaking stuff.
It really is. Especially considering the limited tools he had back then. It makes you wonder what Cooper could have achieved if he had access to all the technology we have today.
Oh, for sure. Imagine him with those high-powered microscopes in genetic sequencing and hormone assays that can measure tiny amounts of hormones in the blood.
It would be incredible. He could have mapped out those intricate networks within the pituitary gland in such detail.
Totally. He could have even pinpointed the specific genes responsible for producing those hormones, or even figured out what those mysterious granules near the blood vessels were made of.
It's mind-blowing to think about all the possibilities, but even with all our fancy technology today, some mysteries still remain unsolved.
Like that enigmatic colloid.
Yeah, what's the deal with that stuff anyway? I know you mentioned that researchers are still trying to figure out its exact function. What are some of the current theories about its role in the pituitary gland?
Well, some scientists believe it acts as a storage reservoir for hormones. Like a pantry, where the pituitary can keep a supply of hormones ready to be released quickly when needed.
So it's like the pituitary's on-demand hormone delivery system.
Exactly. And others think that the colloid might play a role in processing or modifying those hormones, maybe even influencing how active they are.
It's like a hormone finishing school.
Yeah, it's where those hormones get their final touches before they're sent out into the world to do their jobs.
So even though Cooper couldn't definitively solve the mystery of the colloid, his work definitely sparked further research that continues to this day. And his findings on endocrine signaling have really had a lasting impact on how we understand hormonal communication.
No doubt about it. Cooper's observations helped solidify that concept of endocrine signaling, which is now a cornerstone of endocrinology.
It's amazing to think about how his work, which was done over a century ago, is still shaping our understanding of how hormones regulate so many important functions in the body, from growth and development to metabolism and reproduction.
And it all goes back to that idea of the pituitary gland as the conductor of the endocrine orchestra, receiving signals from the brain and then releasing those hormones to tell other glands and organs what to do.
It's this intricate communication network that keeps everything running smoothly. And Cooper's research provided some of the earliest clues about how this whole system works.
It's really remarkable when you think about it. Even those tiny California ground squirrels played a role in these groundbreaking discoveries.
It just goes to show that you never know where the next scientific breakthrough might come from. It could be from studying the brain of a squirrel or a worm or even a bacteria.
Absolutely. The natural world is full of wonders, and there's always something new to discover.
It's that spirit of curiosity and the willingness to ask questions and explore that keeps science moving forward.
Exactly. And it's that same spirit that we hope we've inspired in you today.
Well, I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about today. We've explored the fascinating world of the pituitary gland, delved into the groundbreaking research of Harold J. Cooper, and even imagined how his work might have evolved with today's technology.
We've seen how even seemingly small studies can make significant contributions to scientific progress, and how those early observations can lay the groundwork for future breakthroughs.
It's been an incredible journey through the history of science, culminating in a deeper appreciation for the amazing complexity of the human body and the intricate communication networks that keep everything working in harmony.
And with that, we hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into the brain of the California ground squirrel. It's been a pleasure exploring with you.
Thanks for joining us. Until next time, keep that spirit of curiosity alive and never stop asking questions.